Welcome to the CEC Report. It's October 26. I'm Robert Barwick and I'm joined by CEC leader Craig Isherwood. Welcome, Craig.
Yeah, thanks, Robbie.
In this week's CEC Report, Swan slashes in vain, but people suffer. Strip ASIO's police state powers and get your latest new citizen. Act now, stop nuclear war. So first, Swan slashes in vain, but people suffer. This week, Craig, Treasurer Wayne Swan and Finance Minister Penny Wong have announced that they've got to find $16 billion in budget cuts to meet their goal of a surplus. Why is a surplus so important? Well, let me explain something monetary to the viewers if they don't know already. A surplus is an arbitrary synthetic benchmark that is purely monetarist. What I mean by that, it's a monetary thing that's got no bearing in the real world. By having a surplus, it means that there's no net government spending. That, in other words, what the government takes out of the economy in taxes, it's not putting more back in than that. Right? So there's no net government spending. If the government's not spending extra, that allows, according to Mr. Swan, the Reserve Bank to have maximum scope to stimulate the economy itself by dropping interest rates. And of course, that always dropping interest rates always sounds good. That's why you've got to have a surplus.
It also, Robbie, I mean, most of these governments these days in a monetary system are terrified of these third-party rating agencies, Moody's and Finch's and so forth, and they're terrified about rating downgrades because that increase interest rates and so forth. So there's a direct correlation to the monetary system, that if you get downgraded, as has happened in Queensland recently, you know, the interest payments go up because money is seen to be more risky.
And that goes to the heart of why we still talk about the British Empire, because when you allow your economy to be run as a monetarist system, that power you're talking about, Craig, is a virtually dictatorial power. If governments seem to have to dance to that tune, they will do whatever it takes to do that and put their people in extreme hardship in order to do it. Well, that is the power of an imperial dictatorship. That's what we mean by the British monetary system and the British Empire.
So really, Swan slashes veins and people bleed to death.
Yeah, that's probably the headline we should
Yeah, I
use.
think so, because that's actually what's actually going on here.
It means that the theory of a monetary system takes precedence over people's lives, right? And part of the ridiculousness of it is they have this debate, what's the difference between a $2 billion surplus or a $1 billion deficit? Because it's only $3 billion. It's that amount of money is negligible. But they're hanging everything on this, paper surplus because of these monetary rules. What Swan is doing, though, and that's the purpose of this discussion, like the Liberals, because you mentioned Campbell Newman, the Liberals and Labor are all the same on this. In fact, we call the Labor Party another Liberal Party on it. They're imposing on Australia the exact same mentality that is driving the brutal austerity in Greece.
Well, that even brings up a more poignant point, Robbie, because, we talk about Australia turning into Greece. Well, back at the early part of October, David Murray, the head of the Future Fund, the former head of the Future Fund, came out and said that Australia is heading towards being like Greece. Basically because, as he says, Australia's far too dependent on the rest of the world for both trade and capital. Well, what we see, of course, is the rather rapid downturn in the mining sector because, of course, China is turning downwards. And that has direct result of the fact that exports to Europe have collapsed a lot because of what's happening in Europe. So what he is saying is only echoing actually what we've said on this program many times in the past, that in fact we are turning into Greece. But what really does frighten you is that if we are turning into Greece, I mean, what does that really mean for our viewers? I mean, what does it look like?
Well, think about it like this. They've announced $16 billion in budget cuts in an economy that they still claim is great.
Well, that's the other irony. Yeah.
So when we become Greece, like they're talking about, where are we heading with this? Well, let me give a detail.
And Wayne Swan, as you say, is coming out saying that Australia's economy is robust, it's sound, and so on and so forth. Well, if that's,
we've got to slash it.
Why do we have to slash it?
Well, Craig, this week, October 24th, the New York Times had a report that gave graphic detail about how budget cuts in Greece are killing people, especially in terms of denial of healthcare. And I want to read the opening of this article that was in the New York Times, just to bring it home to the viewers. Quote, as the head of Greece's largest oncology department, Dr. Kostas Syrigis thought he had seen everything. But nothing prepared him for Elena, an unemployed woman whose breast cancer had been diagnosed a year before she came to him. By that time, her cancer had grown to the size of an orange and broken through the skin, leaving a wound that she was draining with paper napkins. Quote, "When we saw her, we were speechless," said Dr. Sirigus, the chief of oncology at Soteria General Hospital in central Athens. "Everyone was crying. Things like that are described in textbooks, but you never see them because, until now, anybody who got sick in this country could always get help." End quote. Life in Greece has been turned on its head since the debt crisis took hold, but in few areas has the change been more striking than in healthcare. Until recently, Greece had a typical European health system, with employers and individuals contributing to a fund that, with government assistance, financed universal care. People who lost their jobs still received unlimited benefits. That changed in July 2011 when Greece signed a loan agreement with international lenders to ward off financial collapse. Now, as stipulated in the deal, Greeks who lose their jobs receive benefits for a maximum of a year. After that, if they are unable to foot the bill, they are on their own, paying all costs out of pocket. About half of Greece's 1.2 million long-term unemployed lack health insurance, a number that is expected to rise sharply in a country with an unemployment rate of 25% and a moribund economy, said Savas Robulis, director of the Labour Institute of the General Confederation of Greek Workers. A new $17.5 billion austerity package of budget cuts and tax increases, agreed upon Wednesday with Greece's international lenders, will make matters only worse, most economists say. So that's the New York Times coverage of this Greek crisis. Craig, Greece is a graphic example of where Wayne Swan's mentality leads. But my question to you is, isn't all this budget cutting in vain? What are the chances he'll ever balance the budget in a collapsing economy?
Robbie, I think you've got to go back to, Cristina Kirchner, the president of Argentina. She said that in response to this whole mentality, dead people can't pay debts. And that's what we're dealing with here. I mean, if you're going to kill off your population by denying them primary health care on the basis of saving money, you've already lost your economy.
Well, this austerity deal in Greece was to ward off economic collapse. It's created economic collapse.
Because you're killing the people. The real wealth of an economy is not in anything other than the ability of the people to contribute to the scientific and technological development of that society. Right? And that means a decent education system, funding basic economic infrastructure instead of having it looted through free trade privatisation policies, as we are witnessing with talk by the government or by various think tanks of selling off over $200 billion of already government-owned assets, privatising all of that. Look, the problem we're leading into, what we're actually in, we've been in for quite a long time, ever since Australia adopted the economic rationalist models and dumped the idea of old labour of supporting the general welfare of the population. So consequently, and there's another element to this which we talk about a lot, Robbie, on this program and in our own organisation, is that the global intention by those that run the monetary system, the British financial oligarchy of London and Wall Street, is population reduction, which has, of course, the other side of that is radical environmentalism, which we're seeing also in the big headlines in the news recently about this Murray-Darling Basin deal. The intention is to shut down food production to reduce the world's population.
And there's an historical example of that from a British standpoint, which is the famine in Ireland, because of course they forced the Irish people to go without their own food, and when they all died, they said, oh well, there was too many of them.
That's right, and that this is actually the policy direction that we're faced with in the world today. It's not an accident, it's a deliberate policy. I mean, people use the example of Africa as a classic it's almost unfortunately a stereotyped example, but we're being Africanised in this country, and a lot of our people are just sitting back and saying, oh, we'll be okay, we'll get past this. Well, what you're seeing now with these budget cuts is the beginning of austerity policies. And people shouldn't, they're going to possibly play this stupid idea, oh, the Liberal Party is going to be better than Labor. The Liberal Party, as you've seen with Campbell Newman, and in a sense lamented by the New South Wales Premier, have already, when I say lamented, I mean the New South Wales Premier was lamenting the fact that they didn't get into austerity and budget cuts early in their first term. The fact is you're seeing policies come forward which are designed to protect the profit of the bankers, the profit of the large multinational privatised corporations and so forth. And I mean, again, ANZ has just come out with a record $5.2 billion profit, right, for the full year. And if you go through the actual profits of the banking system since, say, the privatisation of the Commonwealth Bank, there's huge amounts of money being literally raped out of the economy. Huge amounts of money, or actually not money, but wealth has been shipped offshore through the large multinational mining companies and so forth. So these policies of looting, of free trade, privatisation and economic rationalism, if we don't dump them, everyone is going to be faced with the same horrible circumstances as you see in Greece.
Craig, people have to ask the question, if the economy is not increasing everyone's living standards, what's it for?
Well, that's right.
There's a disconnect here.
At the present time, it's for mozzies and swamps, as Tony Burke obviously has come forward with this Murray-Darling Basin plan.
All right, we've run out of time on that. When we come back, we're going to talk about ASIO's police state powers. Welcome back to the CEC Report. Strip ASIO's police state powers. Craig, the Australian Security Intelligence Organisation, ASIO, our domestic spy agency, it has laws that it received as anti-terrorism laws, has powers, received under anti-terrorism laws that were passed after 9/11. Those laws are up for review very soon. And one of the things that will be decided when they are reviewed is, will they be repealed, will they be amended, or will they become permanent as of 2016? Now, as I said, these were passed after 9/11. They were in fact rammed through by John Howard in 2002, 2003. We in the CEC led the opposition to these powers at the time, including in a full-page ad that we took in the Australian newspaper in 2002 with over 200 dignitaries endorsing it, screaming, "End them, don't amend them." And you remember at the time, in that ad, we were not allowed to use the word fascist in the headline. The Australian newspaper wouldn't let us use it.
Rupert Murdoch.
We had to change it to draconian. Now, the reason we opposed these laws is they were part of a raft of laws, along with laws criminalising terrorism as a special crime, whereas, of course, all terrorism involves breaking already existing crimes. So that you can always charge a terrorist with a crime, but they had to make terrorism its own crime. They had to criminalise terrorist organisations, but people thought that this was against Muslim terrorism, but the laws didn't say Muslim, right? They were written in such a broad way they could be applied against trade unions, they could be applied against nurses on manning picket lines, they could be applied against other political parties like ours. So they were the general raft of laws. ASIO got these specifically draconian powers. They could tap phones without warrants. They could literally disappear people off the street and no one would know where they were taken. They could charge people with terrorism offences but deny the defence of those people charged any access to the evidence that they were charged with. That's got to be kept secret under national security powers, etc.
It's a bit like the recent boat people incidents, which has just been overturned in the High Court, where the people that were seeking asylum weren't allowed to see the case against them by ASIO.
It's exactly that, and it's actually why it's come up. I'll quote George Williams in a minute. I just want to give a bit of a flavour though, because at the time we launched a massive mobilisation on this, and we flooded Canberra with calls of opposition. The Labor Party was in opposition in those days under Simon Crean's leadership, and it showed a bit of a decent streak in Crean, because under his leadership, ASIO, the Labor Party, they let most of the laws go through, but they stopped this ASIO law. They wouldn't let that pass. For that, Simon Crean lost his leadership. He was replaced by Latham, and as soon as Latham took over, the law passed. And so it's been in place for 10 years now. The University of New South Wales Professor of Law, George Williams, told an October 19 dinner of the New South Wales Council for Civil Liberties that these ASIO powers, quote, represent the greatest assault on civil liberties in Australia since World War II. The powers are more consistent with the apparatus of a police state such as General Pinochet's Chile than the laws of a modern democracy. They have no place in Australia and should be repealed. And he was specifically talking about that refugee case that you mentioned. And to compare them to Pinochet, right, people need to know what Pinochet was. I mean, this is as extreme as it gets. Craig, this is only coming up because when we did that mobilisation in 2002 and put a lot of pressure on the government, Howard, in order to prove that they were only to fight terrorism, Howard agreed that the law should have a sunset clause. We said at the time, it's nothing to do with terrorism. The fact that they now want to make them permanent, doesn't that prove that what we said at the time is true, that they're fascist laws to crack down on dissent in a depression?
Economic policy is the issue here, Robbie. That's the first and foremost thing that these laws are directed against. I mean, we know the policies that we just talked about in the previous segment are leading to the denial of healthcare. I mean, the population is going to get enraged.
Yeah, angry and angry.
John Howard's removal of the gun laws and so forth was built upon the premise that, not talked about, of the idea in the future our population, if it's armed, is going to want to possibly take justice into their own hands. Therefore, we have to disarm the population. These laws are the same thing. I mean, there's something like 48 of these laws that have been passed in the last 10 years, one building upon the other, to increase the power of these police state agencies. And they're secretive agencies. You've got ASIO and you have Defence Signals Directorate, which is more pointed to the outside world. ASIS. You have a whole raft of these things. And in the last 10 years, Robbie, the amount of money from the budget that's being put into these things, the size of these institutions has not just doubled but trebled and quadrupled in size. But it's designed, when you have a collapsing economy, to keep people under control. That's fascism. That's what Pinochet used to do.
And there's an example of a contradiction here, because a month or so ago, an extremist Muslim organisation called Hizb ut-Tahrir held an ugly demonstration in Sydney. This is an organisation that does advocate terrorism. It's banned around the world. ASIO has these powers but lets them exist in Australia, right? So what are they using these powers for if they want to keep them permanent? They've
well, take also the other issue that we've talked about on this show before. Look at the murder of the ambassador in Benghazi. It was done by Al Qaeda, Obama now today is in bed with Al Qaeda and these terrorist organisations to overthrow the sovereignty of sovereign governments. So these are state apparatuses that are being used in order to control policies from external sources, policies of destroying sovereignty, and it has nothing to do with terrorism. It's these mechanisms that are going to be used to control people and keep them under control.
Yep. All right, so this is just before we go to the break, this particular issue, that we're raising it now because George Williams' speech was part of the beginning of a campaign, Craig, to make sure that by 2016 these laws are repealed, and they damn well should be repealed. So we'll cover this more as it comes up. But when we come back, we're going to talk about our latest New Citizen hot off the press. Welcome back to the CEC Report. Finally, get your latest New Citizen newspaper. Act now, stop nuclear war. So this is the title, the headline of the CEC's latest New Citizen, which is being printed as we speak, effectively. Everyone watching should get copies of this to pass out to everyone you know. The full headline is Act Now, Stop Nuclear War. Join Lyndon LaRouche, Malcolm Fraser to promote peace. Expose Hugh White, Michael Danby, and the push for war. And what this paper does is it puts in one place, Craig, and it's only 4 pages, it's very short. All the things that we've covered here in the last couple of months on this nuclear war danger, it brings it home, or rams it home really, to Australians that this is the gravest danger we face. And most people in Australia are in the dark about it. except of course CEC readers and viewers, because we talk about it all the time, and the elite decision makers in Australia who debate this behind closed doors, right?
And this paper builds on our last one, Robbie, which is going through in depth a lot of the materials in this one.
In terms of the headline, just to explain, Hugh White and Michael Danby are at opposite ends of the China debate, seemingly. However, both of them are pushing strategies that will condemn Australia to a nuclear conflict with China. Danby overtly, Hugh White more subtly. Michael Danby demands neoconservative style US imperialism. He demands we should treat China like a criminal dictatorship. And of course, where's that going to send us? And he demands things like, we should topple regimes, including China's regime, through Project Democracy style government-backed movements.
They're like the coloured movements in Europe.
Exactly. They're not spontaneous. They're backed by foreign powers like America and Britain.
George Soros.
But they're made to look spontaneous, etc. And of course, the targeted country knows exactly that they're not spontaneous, but that's the method they use. Hugh White, he spreads a more sophisticated British imperial Lord Palmerston view, where he wants us to set ourselves up as a power to play larger powers off against each other, especially in Asia, and the larger powers, of course, are the US and China. He says the only alternative to a US-China war is an Asian concert of powers where America steps down and becomes more of an equal with everybody else. So that's the only alternative to nuclear war. However, he emphasises it ain't going to happen. So in other words, nuclear war is inevitable. Craig, what does the CEC intend with this paper, and what should the viewers do with it?
Well, we're getting it out as widely as we can right across the country, Robbie, because we're very concerned, vitally concerned that the current push by the likes of White and Danby are going to lead to nuclear war. Now, they're just the two figureheads that we take at the present time, but they're the guys that represent these policies.
And they have to lead to nuclear war because in none of their scenarios is peace an option.
Well, that's what we're actually we talk about in the CEC, and LaRouche talks about internationally, the idea of peace through economic development, where you recognise the idea of national sovereignty of sovereign nation states, and from that basis, you then start, well, how do we develop our country for our people? So it's a good neighbour approach, or the concept of what we call the Treaty of Westphalia. The Treaty of Westphalia was an agreement reached to the warring factions of Europe 400 years ago, 1648, to actually stop the 100 Years' War. So consequently, the principle involved was the advantage of the other. Instead of countries worrying about their own selfish strategic self-interest, they say, well, how do we look at the interests of another sovereign country? And here you have China. Yeah, it's got 1.2, 1.4 billion people. It has huge problems trying to feed those people. It needs to be developed. Australia has a capability to provide food, to provide all sorts of different things for China. But and we're talking about this debate of actually, having to contain China. Well, if China doesn't develop, it's in big problems, Robbie. It's going to develop naturally. And you don't have to look at this 18th century method, Lord Palmerston's methods, the British Empire, in order to solve these sorts of issues. So this is the most crucial policy debate in the world at the moment, but particularly in Australia. So that's why we put the paper out.
What should viewers do with the paper?
Get it to all our members of Parliament, get it out to all the thinking people in the area, literally take thousands of copies and spread it around.
Because what will happen, the powers that be then know that this what's been up until now behind the scenes debate is now an open debate, and it forces them to think about it more differently. But with that, we've run out of time.
Again.
Thanks for tuning in to this week's CEC Report, and tune in next week for more.